We're going to be in 2 Kings chapter 12 today, and where this chapter begins, we're introduced to two new kings. We have Jehu in the northern kingdom of Israel and Joash in the south. Depending on which translation of the Bible you use, yours may say Jehoash, but it's the same as Joash, just a variation in the spelling. So how did we get here, and who are those two new kings? Just a few chapters ago, Elisha had talked to a fellow prophet or one of the sons of the prophets and told him to go and anoint Jehu as king of Israel. And he was supposed to go in and anoint Jehu and tell him that the Lord commands him to wipe out the entire family lineage of Ahab and Jezebel for the blood that was shed and everything that they have done, and then run. And he'd done just that. He went in there and anointed him, told him that the Lord's anointed him as king over the northern kingdom of Israel, and he fled. Well, at the same time he was doing that, Elisha had an appointment to anoint Hazael as king of Syria. Hazael was a humble servant of Ben-Hadad. You probably remember Ben-Hadad from previous chapters in the book of Kings. Well, Ben-Hadad was on his deathbed, and he had remembered Elisha, and he says to his servant Hazael, "Go out and seek this man of God to see whether or not I'm going to live." So he finds Elisha, and Hazael says, "I need to know if my master's going to live or if he's going to die." Elisha says, "Well, you can tell him that he's going to live, but he's going to die." And about that time, Elisha just kept staring at Hazael after he told him that he's going to become king. And Hazael says, "Who am I? I'm but a dog. I'm not a ruler or anything." But Elisha kept staring at him, and Hazael became uncomfortable and became embarrassed. And then Elisha burst into tears. When Hazael asked what the matter was, Elisha said, "It's been shown to me what you're going to do to the nation of Israel and to the people of Judah." Hazael, king of Syria, or future king of Syria, would be an instrument of judgment against the people. But now there was a slight problem. Jehu becoming king, part of his deal was to wipe out the descendants of Ahab. Well, the descendants of Ahab and Jezebel were very numerous. In fact, one of them was on the throne in Judah. Wait a minute. Now, Ahab and Jezebel are in the north. How did they have a child on the throne in Judah? King Ahaziah in Judah. His mother, Athaliah, was a daughter of Ahab and Jezebel, so technically he's a grandson of Ahab. Well, Jehu, he had to kill him anyway, and he got two birds with one stone. Ahaziah of Judah had gone north to visit King Joram in Israel when he got there. Well, as they were there visiting, they all of a sudden get a deal from one of their watchmen that said, "There's a group of people coming up here. We need to know if they're friendly, if they're not." So King Joram, he sent a messenger out there. The messenger approached Jehu, and he says, "The king wants to know, do you come in peace?" And he says, "What do you know about peace? Are you going to fall in line with me or fight me," basically? So that messenger stayed. The watchman back at the palace told the king, he says, "The messenger's not returning. What do we do?" So they sent another one. This messenger asked Jehu, said, "Do you come in peace?" The same thing. "What do you know about peace? Fall in behind me." So they did. When they found out that neither messenger was coming back, the person on the watchtower told the king, "I can tell by the erratic and aggressive driving that he does that this is Jehu." Well, of course, they know that means trouble, but I'm sitting here thinking this is probably the only time in Scripture there's a reference to the way somebody drives. So they go out to meet him, and then they realize that Jehu doesn't come in peace. He killed Joram with his bow. Well, Ahaziah took off, and he sent his men after him and got him too. So after he'd got these two kings, Ahaziah and Joram were both killed, he set about finishing his work in the north. Scripture says he killed 70 sons of Ahab. That's a lot of children. And then he done something that was completely unexpected. According to the previous chapter, he had gone up and he told the people, said the kings before us had just played around with Baal worship. I'm going to show you the real way that Baal is to be worshipped. The Baal people got excited, and they gathered everybody around. They said, "Now get everybody inside the house of Baal, in the temple of Baal." So all the priests of Baal, all the worshipers of Baal, everybody was on the inside. Jehu said, "Now there's nobody of the Lord inside this building, right?" And they assured him there wasn't. Well, he had a detachment of about 80 soldiers outside, and he says, "You will forfeit your life if any of these people are allowed to escape alive." So he basically eradicated for one generation the worship of Baal up here in the north. Meanwhile, though, back in Judah, word got back that Ahaziah had been killed. Now, you would think that his mother, Athaliah, she would be mourning, she'd be in sackcloth, she'd be prepping some of her other children just to take the throne. But she showed that she had inherited the evil of Ahab and Jezebel. What was she doing? She started killing all the children of Ahaziah who could possibly take the throne as king. Her own children and her grandchildren she was killing so they would not take the throne. And she sat upon the throne herself as queen mother. There was an infant son, though, that she missed, and there was a lady by the name of Jehoshaphat that took him and hid him from the slaughter. Scripture says she hid him in a bedchamber, or a place where beds are stored, until the slaughter and the time of anger had passed. You know, Jehoshaphat is a person that doesn't really get enough credit for what she has done, and we'll see that in today's verses. She was a half-sister of King Ahaziah, the one who had just been killed, and they had the same dad, King Jehoram, but Athaliah, the wicked woman, was not her mom. This is one of the Bible's examples of an evil stepmother. But Jehoshaphat took Ahaziah's baby son and she hid him. And she just happened to be married to Jehoiada, the priest. So she was able to take him to the temple and keep him in hiding there. Now, two things about this to me are interesting. One, this baby is a descendant of Omri and Ahab. Jehu is requested or commanded to completely eradicate their line. So this child shouldn't be allowed to live. But at the same time, he's the last living descendant of King David. Everybody else has been slaughtered at the hands of Athaliah. God had promised David that he would always have a son on the throne. Now today, that's been permanently fulfilled. Jesus sits on that throne eternally. But had God not used Jehoshaphat to preserve this single male child that day, that line would have been eradicated at the hands of this evil woman who sits on the throne and calls herself the Queen Mother. The devil almost won that day, and he come much closer than he'd ever had. There was a time that the devil had prompted Herod to kill all the male children about the time Jesus was born, and he didn't come close. Jesus had escaped to Egypt. He had prompted Judas to betray Christ for the price of a slave, 30 pieces of silver. Well, what he thought was defeating Christ was actually defeating sin and death, and Satan lost that day too. But this was the closest he had ever come to a victory. When it come to wiping out the line of David, when it come to wiping out the messianic line from which Christ was to come, it all came down to a single infant. Now, this baby was hidden in the temple, and there was pretty heavy security. He was protected at all cost. For 6 years, there was a woman on the throne in Judah at the same time. We don't think about that much when you think back to the book of Kings. You don't think about a woman ruling, but she did, and she made Baal the god there, just as Jezebel had done in the north. In the meantime, though, the temple of God had been neglected, had been attacked, and it had even been looted by this queen mother. And we're going to see in the verses we start in today that it was in really bad shape. But for 6 years, the priest and his wife raised this young boy. All the guards were sworn to secrecy, but time was running out. Athaliah was running Judah into the dirt. I mean, things have gone from bad to worse, and it was time to take action. It's time to put the rightful king on the throne. I'm sure Jehoiada would rather have waited until Joash was, a teenager or in his early 20s or even 30s with some experience and wisdom under his belt, but there was no more time. They couldn't wait any longer. So the priest called all the guards together and laid out his plan. They were going to do this at a time when the guards' shifts were changing. So this time there would be exactly twice as many guards as there normally is at the temple, and Athaliah would not suspect a thing. The new shift of guards would come in, they would discuss things with the old shift that was getting off duty, there'd be a small talk, and then they'd end up leaving. That was the only time that extra people could be there and not raise suspicion with Athaliah. So when a time came, the guards surrounded the young boy. 2 shifts of guards, and the priest Jehoiada made the announcement to the people and presented the rightful king of Judah to the people. a 7-year-old boy. They probably had to do some fitting on the crown to make it work. But there's a great celebration, and it seems like the people had quickly grown tired of Athaliah. So as the trumpets blared and people shouted in celebration, Athaliah come out to investigate, see what's going on. And she seen it, she started yelling, "Treason, treason." Well, the priest said that she shouldn't be killed inside the temple. So he told the people, said, "Get her when she leaves, and everyone who follows her." And that they did. So this evil queen wannabe was dead, and Judah had a new king, a 7-year-old boy. Now, Joash, he was the sitting king, but he was under the advice and direction of Jehoiada the priest. After all, he's 7. And all was well for this time. The people served the Lord, they rededicated their commitment to Him, and they destroyed all the idols of the city. Well, they kept the high places. It seems like everybody wants to eradicate everything, but there's always something they miss. They kept the high places. They were worshiping the Lord in these places, but that was a pagan practice, and God had said there was one place that He was to be worshipped. But it seems like this Joash never really outgrew his need for godly influence and guidance. He was an amazing king when Jehoiada was telling him what to do. But later on, when the priest died, things went downhill quickly. And God knew things would work out that way. Hazael, whom Elisha had anointed, would be used to bring judgment against the people when Joash fell from favor and fell from grace. In fact, that's why Elisha had started crying, because this man who was just a humble servant was going to be a wicked Syrian king, and Elisha had seen a little bit of the wickedness and the evil that he was going to deliver. But for now, let's look at some of the good that this new king has taken upon himself to do in his zeal for serving the Lord. We'll start with verses 4 and 5 in chapter 12. It says, Jehoash, which is Joash, said to the priest, "All the money of the holy things that is brought into the house of the Lord, the money for which each man is assessed, the money from the assessment of persons, and the money that a man's heart prompts him to bring into the house of the Lord, let the priest take, each from his donor, and let them repair the house where any need of repairs is discovered." We don't know how much time has gone by, or if this was maybe one of the first things that he had commanded. But earlier in his reign, he took notice of the terrible conditions of this temple. And it's possible that it had taken some damage from Athaliah and some of the other Baal fanatics. But remember, this building's growing old now. It's been, a long time since Solomon first built it. Without constant maintenance, no building's going to last very long. And of course, the repairs can be costly, especially on a building of that size and one of that magnitude with everything that it has. So they need funds to get started. The king took it upon himself to command these Levite priests to gather the resources and do the repairs. He gives them a list of resources that are to be set aside for that purpose. The first was the dedicated silver, which is a general offerings made to the Lord. Then there's the census silver, which was a half-shekel temple tax. It's been instituted back since the tabernacle was first made. There's a silver from vows. This came from worshipers who gave out of a gratitude for answered prayer or a commitment that they had made to God for whatever reason. Then there's a voluntary silver offering, who people had brought it just for the purpose of restoring the temple. Now, 2 Chronicles adds another money-raising effort that they had instituted. The king told them to go all throughout Judah, door to door, and ask for donations for the repair of the temple. So they had everything planned out for them on how to get the money and to do the needed repairs. Now let's look at verses 6 through 8. It says, "But by the 23rd year of King Jehoash, the priest had made no repairs on the house. Therefore King Jehoash summoned Jehoiada the priest and the other priest, and said to them, Why are you not repairing the house? Now therefore take no more money from your donors, but hand it over for the repair of the house. So the priest agreed that they should take no more money from the people, and that they should not repair the house. After quite some time passed, he realized there's nothing being done to this. So he calls in all the priests, including Jehoiada, who's raised him since infancy, who's saved his very life. And he puts them on a spot. He says, why has nothing been done? They've been faithful to go out and gather the silver like they're told, but nothing's been done to the temple. Sounds kind of fishy at first, doesn't it? Too many times I hear about people who would pay some contractor to remodel their home, do an add-on, do the roof, make their kitchen new again, or some major product, only to have the contractor take the money and run without doing any kind of work. It happens way too often. Now, we aren't told, however, that this happens here. It's easy to read into it and think that. We know that Jehoiada was a godly man, and hopefully so were the rest of the priests. Now, had they been guilty of stealing God's money from the temple, I don't think they would have gotten away with it very long. Now, this is proven that when the king had told them to hand over the silver that they'd been collecting for all these years, they agreed and they complied. Had they been embezzling that money, it would have been spent by now, but it was all still there. The king told them to stop going out and stop collecting from the people. If people still wish to donate, they could, but there's going to be no more going out, no more raising funds to be done by the priest. And the priest agreed to all this, and they all gave back the silver that had been collected. It's all there, every last shekel. So that proves to me that they weren't taking it for ill-gotten gains or taking it with any bad intentions. And the agreement was that they would not only be doing any more collections, but they would not be doing the work. That gives me the reason why the temple wasn't done here, and we'll get to that in just a second. This young king had his heart in the right place when he issued this command for the priest to fix the temple. But in reality, they're priests. They're not builders, they're not carpenters, they're not masons. He should have sent the right people who were qualified for the work. Those priests had no business climbing ladders and trying to cut and shape stones. They were Levites. They're not accustomed to that kind of labor or skilled in any trades other than the work of the temple. I think the real reason that the work had not been done is that they were so busy trying to just be the priest and doing what they were commanded to do by God. They ended up being disobedient to the king because they were trying to keep up with their priestly duties as Levites. Think about all that they had to do. There were daily rituals that needed to be done. The showbread needed changing and all these other things. Then there's the sacrifices. That takes so much time to process. I imagine the doves and all weren't bad, but when the sheep and lambs and the ox come in there and the bulls, I mean, it can be tedious and day-long work. Then there's worship services to conduct. There's personal study that they had to do. They had all kinds of things that demanded their attention in the temple, and they had no time for anything else. So this is likely why they were so quick to agree to stop collecting and let somebody else do the actual building. Thank goodness, they're thinking, we don't have the time. That, and they didn't know the first thing about repair work. The same problem happened again during the days of the early church when the apostles were out preaching the gospel. In Acts chapter 6, verses 1 through 4, it says, "Now in these days when the disciples were increasing in number, a complaint by the Hellenists arose against the Hebrews because their widows were being neglected in the daily distribution. And the 12 summoned the full number of the disciples and said, 'It is not right that we should give up preaching the word of God to serve tables. Therefore, brothers, pick out from among you 7 men of good repute, full of the Spirit and of wisdom, whom we will appoint to this duty. But we will devote ourselves to prayer and to the ministry of the word.'" The apostles were so bogged down with helping people that they had no time to preach, much less to put up with the Karens who were sitting over there complaining about how the job was being done. They realized that they'd become so busy, they're neglecting the teaching and the preaching of the gospel. Now, helping people is important too, but it couldn't be just those guys doing everything. So they appointed helpers to do these tasks, which freed them up to continue doing God's work. Helping people is God's work too. So is repairing the temple, but it shouldn't have been dumped into the laps of these men who didn't have the time and didn't have the skill set to fulfill those needs. Now we'll look at verses 9 through 12. It says, "Then Jehoiada the priest took a chest and bored a hole in the lid of it and set it beside the altar on the right side as one entered the house of the Lord. And the priest guarded the threshold, put in all the money that was brought into the house of the Lord. And whenever they saw that there was much money in the chest, the king's secretary and the high priest came up, and they bagged and counted the money that was found in the house of the Lord. Then they would give the money that was weighed out into the hands of the workmen who had the oversight of the house of the Lord. And they paid it out to the carpenters and the builders who worked on the house of the Lord, and to the masons and the stone cutters, as well as to buy timber and quarried stone for making repairs on the house of the Lord, and for any outlay for the repairs of the house. So now we see a new system to collect funds for the repairs. Instead of going door to door, there's just a box with the hole cut in the lid. For years, people have been used to accessors, knocking on their door, begging for money, and they hadn't seen any progress on the building. More than likely, they're getting pretty tired of it. So they become hesitant to keep on giving. If they're not going to be accomplishing anything, why keep giving money? But this way now, it's strictly voluntary from then on. You only put into something on the rebuilding of the temple if you want, on the repairing of the temple. And people would give as much as the Lord put on their hearts to give. We also see a new way of handling the money. The king's secretary assisted the priest in the bagging and the counting process. Then it was given to trustworthy overseers who paid the workers. Now we see that they had to buy timber. Israel was not known for its lush forests and cedar groves. When they built the original temple, Solomon had to order it from Tyre during the original construction. And most buildings in those regions, they used very little wood. Now some wood was used. You had some beams and doors and supports and everything, but for the most part, things were made out of stone. The phrase for builder is tekton in the Greek. That's the word that's used for Joseph, who raised Jesus. And anytime you hear about Joseph and Jesus, we tend to think carpenter. Well, according to Pastor Mike Fabarez, who studies a lot of Greek, he happened to mention one time in a message that means builder. It could mean carpenter. It could mean stonemason. It could mean a rock worker. It could mean general contractor. That would be the term that we have nowadays. So more than likely, he was a stonemason and worked with rock more than he worked with wood. And in fact, just 4 miles from Nazareth, there was a city that was called Sepphoris. Now, Sepphoris was a beautiful city. It's called the Jewel of Galilee, and it employed many people in its rock quarries. Some commentators speculate that it's possible that Joseph and Jesus both may have worked in Sepphoris. 4 miles, that's a walking commute to work. And it's even possible that they may have built many things within that city. Now, we don't know for a fact, but it's a possibility. But here we see that stone cutters and masons were brought in for the repairs as well as the other trades. Stones don't wear out in time. So I'm thinking that damage was done and there were attacks made against the temple if there's going to have to be stone replacement. So as you can see, this task was far more than this simple group of Levite priests could have handled by themselves, much less doing all that on top of their regular priestly duties. Let's go ahead and look at verses 13 through 16. It says, "But there were not made for the house of the Lord basins of silver, snuffers, bowls, trumpets, or any vessels of gold or of silver from the money that was brought into the house of the Lord. For that was given to the workmen who were repairing the house of the Lord with it. And they did not ask an accounting from the men into whose hand they delivered the money to pay out to the workmen, for they dealt honestly. The money from the guilt offerings and the money from the sin offerings was not brought into the house of the Lord. It belonged to the priest." Now, none of the construction funds that were collected here were used for small things, these instruments and small items that was listed, for example. Joash wanted to make sure that that money was spent on big things, stuff that can be seen by the donors. Some of the smaller bowls and some of the other things that goes into the inner sanctuary or anything near the Holy of Holies, only the high priest could see. Or anything in the inner sanctuary, only the priest could see. The people that were given money had no idea what it was going to, and they're looking at a building that's fallen down with damage and all of these other things, been burned with fire, likely, tell them what all else, and they couldn't see any progress. They deserved to see something being done after all these years of giving. Now, these small things that were kind of put on the back burner, they may have been small, but they're important in the day-to-day functioning of the temple. But the funding for these was to come out of the temple treasury, not the building fund. Now, what happened to all of these items in the first place? Bowls, coals and candle snuffers, they don't just wear out. In 2 Chronicles 24:7, it says, "For the sons of Athaliah, that wicked woman, had broken into the house of God, and had also used all of the dedicated things of the house of the Lord for the Baals." You know, it always helps to read the book of Chronicles anytime you're studying Kings. It gives you the rest of the story. It also tells us in Chronicles how the small items were eventually replaced. If you noticed in verse 15, it says that these workers were people of integrity. They did their job to completion, and they were so honest, they returned the money that was left over. Have you ever heard of a contractor done that? Finished a job under budget, and instead of giving their employees a bonus or just putting it in their savings account, they refunded the customer the leftover money? That's not a very common practice, but that's what these workers did. They had leftover money, so they turned it back in. 2 Chronicles 24 verses 13 and 14 says, "So those who were engaged in the work labored, and the repairing went forward in their hands, and they restored the house of God to its proper condition and strengthened it. And when they had finished, they brought the rest of the money before the king and Jehoiada, and with it were made utensils for the house of the Lord, both for the service and the burnt offerings, and the dishes for incense, and the vessels of gold and silver. And they offered burnt offerings in the house of the Lord regularly all the days of Jehoiada." So it just seems like everyone lived happily ever after, right? Those last few words I just read there out of Chronicles said all the days of Jehoiada. Things were all right while he was around. But our so-called good king, he was just a puppet who was influenced one way or the other by whoever he kept company with. When he was with Jehoiada, he did everything right, and he was zealous for the Lord. But let's look at what happens when that godly influence he had was taken away. 2 Chronicles 24, verses 17 and 18. "Now after the death of Jehoiada, the princes of Judah came and paid homage to the king, and the king listened to them." Boy, that's something. You just go over there and you worship the king, fatten up his ego. Yeah, he's going to do what he wants to keep his new friends. Verse 18, "And they abandoned the house of the Lord, the God of their fathers, and they served the Asherim and the idols. And wrath came upon Judah and Jerusalem for this guilt of theirs." So quickly, this once good king resorted to idol worship. Faster than Solomon's demise. Solomon's foreign wives, with all of their pagan deities and their idols that they had eventually wore this man of God down over time. All it took was the passing of Jehoiada to wear Joash down. But God was trying to be patient, and he sent many prophets into the land, but they were all ignored. But then King Joash hit a new low. I mean, he hit something so low that you can tell he was related to Ahab and Jezebel. 2 Chronicles 24, verses 20 and 21, and 22. "Then the Spirit of God clothed Zechariah, the son of Jehoiada the priest, and he stood above the people and said to them, 'Thus says God, why do you break the commandments of the Lord so that you can prosper? Because you have forsaken the Lord, he has forsaken you.' But they conspired against him, and by the command of the king they stoned him with stones in the court of the house of the Lord. Thus Joash the king did not remember the kindness that Jehoiada, Zechariah's father, had shown him, but killed his son. And while he was dying, he said, 'May the Lord see and avenge.'" How can anybody stoop that low? I mean, this was the man that raised you. This was the son of the man that raised you. I find it shocking what the hearts of men are capable of. But let me tell you who isn't shocked or surprised at all by the things people do. God. He knew long ago that this was going to happen. Do you remember me saying at the beginning of this video how Elisha was crying as he anointed Hazael king over Syria? Because Hazael would one day, the things that he would do to Israel and Judah? Well, I mean, this was way back when Hazael was just a humble servant, and Joash was probably not even in the womb yet. But God knew. Now comes the reason that Hazael was to become king of Syria. God foreknew that Judah's king would fall from grace, and the time for judgment was now. 2 Chronicles 24, beginning in verse 23. At the end of the year, the army of the Syrians came up against Joash. They came to Judah and Jerusalem and destroyed all the princes of the people from among the people and sent all their spoil to the king of Damascus. Now, this wasn't the first time that the Syrians had come against Joash. They had come once before, but rather than seeking the Lord, rather than going to the Lord in prayer about it or dependent upon God, he takes some of the things from the temple and gives it to the Syrians. Here, save your army, take our loot, because that's why they would invade you. They want your stuff. So he just gave them the stuff, said, save your military, just take this, and he bought them off. But it was at the end of the year. It didn't come back very long. Verse 23 says, at the end of the year, they come back. They destroyed these princes that had puffed up Joash's ego and sent all their spoils to the king of Damascus. Verse 24 says, though the army of the Syrians had come with a few men, the Lord delivered into their hands a very great army, because Judah had forsaken the Lord, the God of their fathers. Thus they executed judgment on Joash. So basically, the Syrians are coming back again, but now they've only got a handful of people. Judah has a decently sized army at this time, so they're thinking about it's still fresh in their mind the things that it had cost them the last time the Syrians are down, and they're down at the end of the same year. So they're thinking, there's just that few people out there, let's go destroy them. And it didn't happen. Anytime the Lord is not in something that you're doing, it's going to fail. It don't matter if it's a war. It don't matter if it's a personal project. Anything that you are doing, if the Lord is against it, it is not going to prosper. So this is how they executed judgment on Joash, the small army of just a few men who had overcome the great army of Judah. Verse 25 says, when they had departed from him, leaving him severely wounded, his servants conspired against him because of the blood of the son of Jehoiada the priest, and they killed him on his own bed. So he died, and they buried him in the city of David, but they did not bury him in the tombs of the kings. This is such a tragic end to a young man who started out so well. He was king by 7. He had so much going for him. He had the godly influence of Jehoiada, and he's doing so great at first. The first thing he did was prompted that the temple should be restored and repaired to its original glory. And he had surrounded himself with evil people of influence after his godly influencer was taken away. And this is summed up completely in the very first psalm that's recorded in Scripture. Psalms 1:1. Blessed is the man who walks not in the counsel of the wicked, nor stands in the way of sinners, nor sits in the seat of scoffers. Psalm 1:6. For the Lord knows the way of the righteous, but the way of the wicked will perish. Be careful of the people around you because they influence you. You may think, I'm my own person. People don't influence me. Yeah, they do. What you read influences you. What you watch influences you. The people that you hang around influences you. And we just read an account of that very principle about hanging around with bad influences come to pass in the life of a young king named Joash.